Hi, I am Elena Lopez, and I'm here today to talk to you about some of the issues I want you to consider as you enter the world of work. I'm a business ethics consultant. I work in human rights, and I work in anti-bribery and anti-corruption. When I was growing up in Spain, I was very interested in issues of bribery and corruption, perhaps because I was seeing it on the news every day. And as I studied PPE at Warwick and then went on to do my development studies master's at Cambridge University, I was increasingly interested in what people could do to prevent bribery and corruption from happening and prevent human rights abuses from happening. And I thought that in order to work in the field, I would need to do so from the public side, So I thought I would have to be drafting laws, drafting policies, working in government to stop bribery and corruption from happening and from stopping human rights abuses from happening. But what I learned in my master's was that actually there is a whole private side to it, a field of business ethics that I didn't know about. And this is both within companies, like compliance officers or human rights officers that are working within companies to look at the programs that they have to ensure they're not impacting negatively on society. And the wider business ethics field with consultants and experts that advise these companies on how to meet legislation. And that is what I do today. I'm a business ethics consultant. And the work I do is so important because we all know what happens when things go wrong. You might have seen some of these headlines or scandals. You might have seen many others because we hear about scandals every day, every week, every month. You might have heard of the Rana Plaza building collapse in Bangladesh in 2013, where more than 1,100 people died in one of the biggest industrial disasters in history. And this was a building that hosted 5 garment factories, and workers were going to work, forced to work, even though it was clear that the building wasn't safe. You might have heard in 2020 of the scandal from Boohoo, where it was found out that they were supplying for suppliers in Leicester, where workers were being paid as little as £3.5 an hour, when the minimum wage in the UK at the time was £8.72 an hour, so much higher. This was also in the middle of the pandemic, and it was also found that workers didn't have the sort of safety space between each other. They didn't have PPE. You might have heard, in looking at sort of environmental rights, you might have heard about the Volkswagen Dieselgate scandal. This was when, in 2015, it was found that Volkswagen cars, or some of those cars, were fitted with technology that meant that even though they looked compliant with EU laws about emissions, in fact, they were emitting up to 40 times the permitted amount of nitrogen dioxide. Looking at sort of bribery and corruption issues, you might have heard of the Goldman Sachs scandal, one of the biggest fines in the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act legislation in the US. They've been fined with a $2.9 billion fine in connection with the bribes that they were paying to Malaysian and Abu Dhabi officials to get lucrative business, and they made hundreds of millions out of this. So you might have seen these sort of headlines and many others, but as a business ethics consultant, I can tell you that what you see on the news is only a small proportion of the injustices that occur every day in companies around the world. You don't really see headlines or whole articles about some of the things I've seen. You don't see articles about the pregnancy tests that women are being asked to take every month by their employer to make sure they're not pregnant, so that if they are, they're fired. You haven't seen the cameras that I've seen in factories that make sure that employees are monitored so they don't sit down and stop working at any point in the day. You won't have heard necessarily all the issues with water scarcity in factories and plantations and farms the scorching heat, the bullying, harassment, and discrimination of minority groups in companies around the world. And as well, for example, trade union representatives being dismissed when they're trying to speak up about some of these issues. But I can tell you these things happen because I've seen them in my work. But I can also assure you that companies are working hard every day to try to reduce both the big impacts that we've seen in the news, as well as the small impacts. And I can assure that because otherwise I would be out of a job. So nowadays, the clients that I have and the consultancy I work for have are generally big companies that have subsidiaries around the world, and they want to know what's really going on in their operations. It is public institutions, it is global firms, it is sort of big investors that want us to look into the companies they're invested in to make sure they're not having a negative impact, whether it's on labor rights or on bribery and corruption. And what I do within my work is find solutions, find recommendations for all these clients on what they need to do. So they come to us after a big scandal because something has gone wrong and they want to make sure it doesn't happen again. Or when there's been a scandal in their industry, so they've seen X company has had this issue, they want to make sure they don't have it. It is also to make sure that we help them meet legislation. So the law says that I need to have this. How do I make sure I do? And also to go beyond the law, to do what we consider as best practice. In order to do this, I investigate how companies treat workers. I investigate how they treat their communities and the environment. And when I look at bribery and corruption, I'm doing similarly because I'm seeing at how the impact on the public system, the government, how they interact with government officials, with police, with judges. So in order to do my work, I do a lot of desktop research, I do a lot of document review, but most importantly, I spend my time talking to people. I speak to CEOs, C-suite executives, managing directors, to governments. I speak to NGOs, I speak to suppliers and communities, and I speak to workers. The majority of my time I spend it speaking to workers. They might be in standard offices or in doing manual labor in farms, plantations, in factories, in oil rigs, all over the world. And I speak to them as an independent third-party outsider of the company or the institution, gathering information in a confidential way, so then I can go back to the companies and give them sort of aggregate trends. I never say, this person told me this, but we talk about issues that I find, and then importantly, we talk about the recommendations that we give them and the action plan. What we're trying ultimately is to make sure they don't impact on human rights and they reduce the sort of bribery and corruption risks that they face. And why do companies come to us? Of course, we've spoken about scandals, and this is something they want to avoid. But another important point is that companies are made up of people, like you and I. And it's people that went to university and studied something that they loved, and they want to then go into the world of work and do it ethically. They don't want to be ashamed about the work they do and the companies they work for. And so it is people that want to do the right thing. And that's what I find very often with my clients. Other companies come to us because of the increasing legislation in both bribery and corruption and human rights. When the company I work for started in 2000, there was very little work in business ethics. Companies didn't really care about these topics. But over time, we've seen that increasingly companies are coming to us and they care. And part of it is because of legislation. Because we had legislation in the US, the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, that was strengthened in 1998. Then we had the UK Bribery Act, 2010, UK Modern Slavery Act, 2015, French laws on bribery and corruption and human rights, 2017. whistleblowing directive in the EU 2019. And now, this year, we have more human rights due diligence laws in Europe, Germany, and Norway, the Transparency Act. And more pressure for the EU to bring legislation that will apply to all EU members, which also gives more pressure to the UK to have similar legislation. Other companies come to us because of the consumer pressure, because those scandals and just greater awareness by consumers means that actually, if they don't change their practices, they will have less revenue because people won't buy their products or their services. And as I mentioned, some of our clients are investors, so we really see the increase of ESG investing, of our environmental, social, and governance investing, which means that companies also care about these issues because they have to in order to bring in the investment that they need to grow. And in the end, it makes sense for companies to do the right thing and to work ethically, because the costs of not doing so are too high. As we said, there are reputational costs. There are costs together in relation to the legislation, like legal fines and legal fees and prison time. There is the loss of management time, having to deal with the scandals. It's also harder to recruit people. And so in general, it also makes sense for companies increasingly, as people are more aware of these issues, to work ethically. So most of you sitting here are either finishing university or starting this very exciting journey. Some of you might work in the business ethics field, like me, as a business ethics consultant, as a human rights officer or compliance officer within a company. But most likely, most of you will work in something completely different, whether it's tech, finance, marketing, human resources, social media, medicine, research, whatever it is, that is not necessarily business ethics. And what I want you to take away from this talk is that even if your career is outside of business ethics strictly, these issues will still impact your life. And there is also something that you can do to make sure that businesses are more ethical. The internal policies that govern your work will influence the culture, the safety, the quality that you have in your future jobs. And there are certain things that you can do in your job, no matter where it is, whether it's in a private company or a public institution, because all companies and all public institutions anyway still have policies and procedures. What you can do is give feedback, is to tell people like me that are drafting those policies and that are setting sort of programs and strategies about culture and the way we treat others and the way we treat our suppliers and our supply chains, etc., what works and what doesn't. So you really need to tell us so that we can build that into those policies. It's also very important that you speak up when you see something that is not right. When you see someone being mistreated, bullied, harassed, when you think something suspicious is going on, when you're worried about an impact that you have in that your company has in general, it's really important that you speak up. And most companies now need to have a whistleblowing or speaking up system, a line, because this is increasingly being asked of companies with legislation. And the more people that use those lines, the more people that say that something is an issue, the stronger a sign it sends to companies so that they know that there is a systemic issue that they need to address. And they do look at these speak up lines very carefully to address them. Moreover, as you progress in your career, you might manage a team, supervise a team, and managers make all the difference. It's really important that as you have that role of power, you set a culture of care where people can speak up, they can tell you their concerns, where certain behaviors are not allowed and not tolerated. And it's always important how you treat people, but particularly when you're in a position of power, it's really important. And this is something that I see all the time in my work. It makes a big difference. Besides and beyond your working life, your private life, now as a student or even after while you are working, is really important, and you can make a difference in the things that you do in your private life. So you can learn more about the risks and about business ethics. You can learn more about what companies are and aren't doing. You can listen to bribery and corruption podcasts like the Global Anti-Corruption Podcast. You can listen and read different blogs on the issues. There is, for example, a very useful page called Business and Human Rights Resource Center, and they have fantastic articles every day on scandals, on legislation, on what's going on. You can be critical in your social media consumption when you see ads of companies, when you see people talking about companies that you should buy things from, to really investigate and learn what's behind that. What are the labor rights consequences of fast fashion? What are sort of the bullying and harassment scandals in video gaming companies, etc.? And you can use social media to demand companies to be more transparent, to tell your friends and family about what you found and why they shouldn't be spending money somewhere. And that follows to my next point. You can spend wisely. You can think about where you're buying everything that you're buying from to make sure that you're not contributing to the revenue of companies that are damaging the earth and hurting both their employees and the communities around their operations. And another thing that you can do as you finish university is to research your employer. You have the luxury of being in a market where employers want you. And so you can look at the policies that they have, the reports that they have, what they're disclosing, to see if their culture matches your expectations and what you want in your working life. And this is also something that you can bring up in the interviews. The more you think about these issues and make them a part of your daily thinking, the more you will think about them when you're in the working world, and the more you will be able to hold your employer accountable.